Well, thank you. So before I begin, a confession. For most of my professional career, I didn't care about enterprise botnets. Most of my career was spent in service provider security, BGP security, encryption of control plane, DDoS, things that affect the core of the global backbone. But this talk is about how I came to care very deeply about enterprise botnets and how my world of service provider security very much has begun to overlap with enterprise security, and particularly enterprise IoT botnets. So my world is this on the right. Over the last 5 to 10 years, attacks against banks, government, gamers, DDoS in general, has been growing exponentially. Every year, the attacks are doubling. The only thing that is growing faster than DDoS traffic in the internet is, well, nothing. DDoS is growing faster than any other type of traffic. And in particular, this type of growth, an exponential like this, poses a systemic threat not to an enterprise, not to a given link, but to the internet, to global connectivity. So I'm very concerned about this graph. And there's a number of reasons why this graph is going like this. But one reason is enterprise botnets. For most of the internet's history, most DDoS came with spoofed traffic, spoofed to misconfigured DNS servers, NTP servers, CLDAP, but generally it was spoofed traffic out of, give or take, 50 to 100 Eastern European and Asian data centers that either directly sold spoofing capability or indirectly. It's always hard, by the way, in the internet to distinguish between malice and, incompetence. The net result is the same. But until really 2022, almost all DDoS was spoofed. And providers spent literally billions of dollars basically getting the upper hand, deploying billions of dollars of anti-DDoS kit all throughout the networks. The challenge is we've crossed sort of the Rubicon. Botnet traffic, which is graphed on red, has always been part of DDoS, but generally it was quite small. It was 5%, 10%, almost negligible compared to the overall bulk of DDoS. But DDoS botnets have been growing each year. In 2023, for the first time, DDoS botnets, particularly enterprise, and by the way, this really is an enterprise problem because subscribers are NATed, CGNAT, they're not usually directly connected. So this is largely enterprise, and by the way, it's US enterprise, and I'll talk more about that coming up, are the largest contributor, and in 2023, the majority of DDoS is coming from enterprise IoT botnets, and certainly the majority of complex attacks all involve enterprise IoT botnets. And I'll explain why that's happening, and I'll even explain who's at fault for all of this happening over the next couple of slides. So part of the problem is enterprise, and it's enterprise love of IoT. Every branch office loves to have cameras, DVR, every gas station, every bank. And enterprise, the only thing enterprises love more than deploying these IoT is to port forward traffic through their firewall, so of course the IoT devices are externally reachable. But we're now on an exponential clip for IoT devices being deployed. We're now in the billions of devices. Certainly not all of these devices are exposed to the internet, not directly reachable. And certainly not all of these devices are compromised. But it turns out when you've got 4 billion devices, you don't need a very large percentage to be compromised before you start to have a really significant problem. But the bigger problem is not the enterprise. The bigger problem is actually service providers. For most of the internet's history, cable modems, DSL were all asymmetric. It was always sort of 90-10, 90% of the bandwidth versus 10% of it up. This was due to cable modems and doxis and other issues. But the graph actually on the right gives a little bit of a glimpse where we are. Now, I apologize. I'm a former academic, so I love cumulative distribution graphs. But really, all the graph on the right is showing, or trying to show, is that if you look at the percentage of devices, which is pretty far over the left, you get to 60, 70%. Most devices today that are engaged in botnet activity are under 10 megabit up. And again, I should explain a little bit about what we're doing. I'll explain in a few more slides, but we spent the last year tracking about 1 million botnets with service provider partners, understanding their behavior, what were they attacking, what were their capabilities. So this is a graph reflecting a year of tracking about 1 million botnet devices and understanding how much upstream do they have. And the good news is for most of recorded internet history, it was like 10 megabits. So it takes a lot of botnets to cause any damage. And as long as this graph doesn't change, as long as nothing changes, we're probably okay. The problem is this. The problem is service providers in Europe and the US, for lack of a better word, are engaged in a marketing war. Every service provider is now offering gigabit symmetric. That's a gigabit up, gigabit down. And if you talk to service providers, it's quite interesting. You ask, what application could use gigabit up and gigabit down? Why do you need this? And the service providers laugh, and they'll tell you it's basically a marketing tool. There is no application that requires gigabit up. This is solely so we can keep charging our rates, and the enterprise and consumer can believe they're getting additional value, but they'll never use it. And mostly they're right. In fact, there is no application, sans one, that will use a gigabit upstream. There really is only one, and that is DDoS botnets. And every provider in Europe, every provider in the US is now rolling out gigabit upstream to their enterprises, including the some odd million botnets that previously were all 10 megabit connected. The other problem, I think, is law enforcement, and maybe it's not a problem. Law enforcement, they had a great takedown in February. There continues to be a lot of activity where law enforcement has gone after these Eastern European, some of the US-based hosting and DDoS sites. And in fact, it turns out that the global conflict recently helped disconnect some of them as sort of other collateral damage. So there is a lot of law enforcement activity. But the best way to judge a market is not by the number of press releases and press conferences about takedowns and arrests. But whether you're judging an illegal drug market, stolen cars or others, the best way to judge a market is by money, the price. And if you look at the price going to 100 or some odd dark websites, booter websites, DDoS websites, if you look at the prices in US dollars over the last 5 years, it does not look good. In fact, the price is cratering. The price went from give or take $1,000 to launch a gigabit attack in 100 gigabit attack, in 2018, to now we're likely in 2023 sub $20, sub $10. The price is cratering. So this is probably the best indication of law enforcement. And the problem necessarily isn't law enforcement, but there's just so much money in the economy driving DDoS attacks, extortion. And we've also gone beyond, as I'll talk about later, small gangs of 5, 10 people, to we now have state sponsors actively engaged in leveraging this IoT infrastructure as well. So I've become very interested in enterprise IoT botnets and spent the better part of the last year with our team studying or trying to study them in the wild. Can you study them? Can you study 1 million of them? What are they doing? Who's controlling them? What type of capabilities and upstream do they have? When they're attacking, who are they attacking? Can you understand what else are they doing? And of course, what we ultimately care about is what can you do about all of this as we start to continue an exponential growth in both the number of IoT devices, the number of compromised IoT devices, and of course, the number of them that are used in DDoS and botnet attacks. So just a quick word about how we collected this data. So we do a few things as part of Nokia. One is, if you're familiar with, I don't know, Census and Shodan or others, we crawl every day, every IPv4 on the internet, every IPv6, trying to understand, can we identify what type of ports are open? Can we understand, like Nmap, what type of device it is? Can we understand if there's CVE associated with it? So we do this across the internet. The only difference is we don't actually sell this data. We just use it internally as part of our service provider security product. But very much massive global scale crawling of every IPv4 and active v6 that we can find. Nokia, at least my part of Nokia, sells to service providers. For those of you who still think of Nokia as a cell phone provider, well, we now have a branded phone, but largely Nokia's business is building the wireless and mobile networks of the world. Probably one of the largest providers in backhaul and mobile networks, fixed line networks, really at the core of the internet. Huge portion of internet traffic goes through Nokia-supported internet service providers, though we're really not as much in the phone business anymore. So a portion of our customers, including some of the largest global providers, have our security product. In addition to using the security product, they've agreed to share data with us for research like this about botnets. So again, we've got some visibility across the internet, including global transit providers, able to watch and drill in on compromised devices once we identify them over long periods of time to do a longitudinal study of millions of compromised enterprise devices. I should say that there's some challenges. We don't have complete visibility. Botnets are dynamic. Bots come, they go. We're also mainly focused on botnets that we can see, meaning botnets are involved in click fraud and all sorts of intrusion attempts. For us to see them in global internet, they actually have to generate a certain level of traffic, just given the nature of our infrastructure and visibility. So typically, we are looking not at all botnets, but on DDoS botnets. And it's also hard, too, right? Adversaries, again, they'll they try to evade crawling. They will stick Google home pages, in case you aren't naive and think every compromised device is Google out there, if you're not careful. So it's adversarial, but I think our largest problem is our adversaries can actually exercise CVE. They can actually go to a device and see if the exploit works. So we can only sometimes guess or infer. I'm not actually allowed to guess passwords. We're not allowed to actually do any exploits. So there are challenges in how we classify ethical, legal, and technical limits to the data. But let's talk about the data. If you actually look at a year's worth of data, you'll see that there's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 500,000 to 1 million active compromised IoT devices engaged on a daily basis in DDoS, botnets, attacks. Now, I actually found this, I don't know what I expected. I expected maybe 10 million, 100, there's 4 billion IPv4. I don't know how many I expected. But, it's a fairly modest number in the scheme of things. About 1 million compromised devices on a daily basis actively engaged in attacking governments, banks, other enterprise. But the number I think that is really got my attention is the next number. If you look at the capacity of all these botnets, if you watch them over the course of a year and saw how much they were able to generate during attacks, and you add it all up, you come to a number of about 50 to 100 tera. Now, for those of you who these numbers don't roll off your tongue, this is a big number. In fact, this number is bigger than any global transit provider has. They'll be in the 50, 60, tera range. So this number, if and only if all the botnets were used at once, this is enough to disrupt global internet traffic, not just an enterprise. This is enough to disrupt entire countries, global transit, and about 1 to 2 terabit peak. But the good news is they're not all used at once. The good news, at least for now, if you look at these botnets in practice, most of the botnet market seems really fragmented. We'll see 5,000 bots used at a time in attack, sometimes 30,000. It was only really in February of last year that we started to see botnets, including bots we had never seen used before, in the 60,000, 70,000 range. So there's some new entrants that had been holding on to a large pool of botnets, suddenly exercised at the start of some of the global conflict. So largely, I think the botnet market had been, small groups. It is interesting if you start to see state actors or likely state actors get involved with this type of firepower involved. So I want to talk a little bit about when you look at these million devices, actually what are they? So as I said previously, these are mostly an enterprise problem. And it's an enterprise problem, again, because you need typically things that are connected, externally reachable, i.e. not behind a NAT, not behind a CG NAT, but things that actually have static IPs. So if you look at it, it mostly is today a CPE problem, which is really what I mean by customer and modem. Typically, they are things like MikroTik or other types of Eastern European enterprise devices. The second biggest class is, as I said, DVRs. Not necessarily the web cameras themselves, but the digital video recorders that all the cameras connect to, that are in every gas station, every convenience store, every enterprise branch office in the world. And for whatever reason, they're all externally reachable via either directly or port forwarding. And also, not surprisingly, they've never been updated. They're all running code with known CVEs, and I'll show an example in just a slide. Most of them are, again, sort of enterprise devices. We are seeing now some large cloud botnets. That is, folks that, whether they have bought it, whether they've compromised accounts. Again, it's hard to distinguish malice from, incompetence. But there's 5 cloud providers that have a very serious and growing bot problem. And while the numbers are small in terms of the number of compromised servers, these guys are 10 gig. So you just need a fairly small number of these compared to the 10 meg enterprise to have a problem. So I wanted to actually make this a little more grounded and provide some examples. So we track attacks, hundreds of attacks per day. This is an attack I pulled out at random in November of 2022 against US DoD network. So fairly good-sized attack involving about 31,000 IPs, 832 gig. And again, for those of you not familiar with sort of the relative scope, trust me when I say this is legit. This is a good size. This would have been more than enough to disrupt government network, DoD network. This is getting into the 1 terabit range of attacks. About 200 million packets per second. So fairly decent attack. It was short-lived, right? A lot of these attacks we see are part of intrusion attempts or disrupting for short periods. But this is actually graphing the BPS, the PPS, and the number of IPs. So not all of this attack was botnet, but a significant portion of this attack was botnet. So let's drill in, and again, try to actually make this a little more concrete. Let's drill into one of these IPs. So I won't go through all of this, but this is kind of like a TCP dump debugging output. You'll see the port number, the source address, the destination address, all sort of obfuscated, the port number. As I said, we call it genome. We actually do mapping of the internet. So the column on the far right is showing in red something that's DDoS bot, means it's known bad. We've seen it actively engaged in DDoS in the last 3-4 days, last 48 hours. Orange means we've crawled it, and via Nmap or other mechanisms, we've recognized it has a known CVE, so could be compromised or is likely compromised. And again, your eyes glaze over if you look at these attacks, just thousands and hundreds of thousands of enterprise IPs all doing the same thing. But who is this one IP that's circled, and can we get more information about it? Well, it turns out you can actually connect to this IP. You can connect to this IP, and you have a nice view of the front lobby. There's also a view of the lunchroom and the loading dock, and a few other parts of the office. And not only can you connect to this IP, but you can actually get to the debug page and find out the make and model number. And I should say, by the way, one of the biggest problems for service providers is not knowing they've botnets in their enterprise customers. But what do you do about it? I've heard stories of service providers calling an enterprise and saying, hey, you're compromised. Your DVR is engaged in botnets. And the enterprise IT guy says, we don't have any DVR, as the service provider is watching him on the video monitor. So it does lead to some challenging discussions. But this is one IP. So you can get the make and model number. If you can get the make and model number, then, well, you need to be an advanced hacker. You need to have attended the last 10 years of RSAC to possibly compromise this. Some of you are shaking your head. No, you need Google, or I guess ChatGPT would be the new way to do it. But with Google, in the make and model number, you can get the CVE. With the CVE, it is one more search to get the actual exploit code. Helpfully, I love GitHub, helpfully on GitHub, all ready to go and documented. So the bar for some of these is just incredibly low. This is not advanced hacking. It is just, I think the harder part actually is the infrastructure of managing all of these and the code once you've actually exploited. And by the way, you know, folks love to make fun of DVRs and some of these very cheap manufacturers. People in the security industry say the DVR and the cheap, you know, Asian camera companies don't care about security. I am here to tell you it's not true. If you look at the source code and you think they don't care about password complexity, you're wrong. This particular vendor, if you look at their source code, does care about password complexity. And in fact, I'm guessing there must have been a story behind this. 1, 2, 3, 4 is now disallowed. But it's not just these DVRs. It's all types of devices in the enterprise. It's medical imaging. It is every enterprise thermostat and HVAC system seems like it's connected. There's things like thermal imaging cameras that you can connect to on the internet. I have no idea what this is showing. Showing some type of factory, and I'm assuming it's something hot at the bottom. But again, you can connect to this thermal imaging camera. You can find the make and model number of it, and you know, it's a couple of Google searches, and you have compromised this device. And this just keeps happening. There's just so many of these devices accessible on the internet with almost no security to speak of. So let's look at one of these thermal cameras for about 24 hours. What is this doing? Well, the thermal camera is sending video, thermal imaging video up somewhere. But mostly what it's doing is not that. Mostly this camera, every day, all day, is part of what appears to be a commercial DDoS service. And while I obfuscated who it's attacking a range of banks, governments, and it turns out there's just a lot of DDoS today is from the US to China. So we are involved in some type of interscene warfare between different Chinese companies or different Chinese bots. But this thermal imaging camera is no different. It's involved, give or take, if you watch it, in about 30 to 50 DDoS per day, all day, attacking different parts of the world, different countries. And this is pretty typical. If you look at tens of thousands of these devices, this is what they're doing. They're just attacking each day. Typically, again, I'll talk about where it's coming from. So part of the problem with all of this is that the traditional security model for service providers and even enterprise was about protecting the external edge. It was about deploying DDoS and filters on the external edge. The problem today is, you know, most DDoS is, or increasingly, that's not the DDoS. The DDoS is actually coming from within US enterprise networks to other US enterprise networks, as well as to other parts of the world. And a lot of the DDoS technology to block this was based around the idea that you could block DNS packets of a certain size were bad, or NTP packets. or you could rate limit or shape traffic. What's also really problematic about botnets is the packets aren't necessarily bad. The packets aren't spoofed. In the old days, you could find someone did a bad job of spoofing packets, or the given end device wasn't running a web server or a Linux stack and couldn't respond to different types of redirects. These are all valid Linux stacks, poorly secured Linux stacks, but otherwise completely valid and pass all the other types of sort of DDoS protection you would have used in the past. So really problematic, I think, for the state of sort of security and the DDoS and protecting networks as we start to lose what had been these fundamental capabilities. As I mentioned before, for the most part of my career, the US was a net importer of DDoS. DDoS came from China or Russia, Eastern US companies were attacked by these hosting centers in Eastern Europe. In 2023, all of that has changed. The US, in fact, is a net exporter. I mean, congratulations, I think. At least one trade imbalance has been resolved. But the US is now a net exporter of DDoS. In fact, is one of the largest exporters of DDoS in the world, attacking other countries. We're followed by Korea, Taiwan, and other typically highly developed, highly connected Asian economies. But the US definitely has the lead in terms of the number of compromised IoT devices. And as I said, this is the old horror trope. Many of you are younger than I am, but I still remember the 80s horror movies where, the call comes and the calls and it turns out the killer is from inside the house. We very much have a problem now that's not the rest of the world, but the problem is in Europe and the US. It's within our own enterprise networks is the problem. And we can see just over time what this looks like. If you actually graph what the US is doing, US was a very significant combatant, not on the ground militarily, but we've been throughout the Russia-Ukraine conflict. US enterprise botnets have been attacking both countries all throughout. But it's also France, Hong Kong, any given day it varies depending on what's happening in the world, what type of scheme. But US enterprises, whether you know it or not, are active participants in an ongoing cyber conflict, as well as criminal activity. So as I come to sort of the last few slides, just want to say a few sort of concluding words. I care most about the enterprise botnets when they started to pose a significant systemic threat to the global backbone. When enterprise were 10 megabits up, really didn't matter. As we're starting to see every US and European service provider move to gigabit symmetric, we have enough firepower to really disrupt global internet traffic for extended periods of time. So part of this talk is about trying to get enterprises to care. There certainly is the financial and performance. I have service provider friends that regularly get customers calling saying we have awful performance. And they have awful performance, as it turns out, because they're compromised and their IoT is generating DDoS all the day and every day. But it is also a problem for enterprise when we look at what these are doing. Most of these devices are also doing other things. While not predominant, we do see Bitcoin mining. We do see some of these devices scanning and all the other sorts of illicit attack activity. And I think a lot of the IoT devices are sometimes used as a first step for broader intrusion attempts. So very much, if you don't care about the global internet, very much, I think this does pose challenges, both financial, legal, liability for enterprise as well. So, I think the ask of this is enterprise IoT botnets are starting to get out of hand. They are now the majority of DDoS activity. They're about to be 1 gigabit connected to the internet, and they're growing at an exponential clip over time. So really the ask is to kind of sound the alarm. It is not taking out networks. DDoS is a problem today, but the potential for where we could be 24 months from now is really significant if both these graphs, the exponential growth of IoT and the 1 gigabit connectivity, start to intersect, and throw in, by the way, some state actors as well into the mix. And it's a pretty heady threat to global internet connectivity. So really trying to just raise the alarm. We are working with service providers and others trying to provide data on this growth and on the activity and on things you can do to remediate that activity. And I should say it's really hard for service providers. Service providers often know they have huge numbers of corrupted, compromised enterprise, but none of them want to call the enterprise. It's a very long discussion to have to explain to the enterprise they're corrupted. Yes, you can see them on the DVR. Generally, there hasn't been a business model that sort of accommodates this. So this is much a business problem as it is a technical problem. And I'll just finish off. I'm even well ahead of schedule. Just repeating, we now have what appears to be a threat to the global internet connectivity. We see state sponsors actively engaged. 50 to 100 is enough to disrupt if it was all used at once. What is really scary about the state actors is what had been a fragmented market. If someone actually has control of not just 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, gets into these large number of botnets, it's a very different equation from where we have been historically. And as I said, I didn't used to care about enterprise botnets. They were an annoyance. They weren't really on my radar as a guy that does internet service provider security. It's clear to me, and I hope clear to you after this talk, that this is a threat not just to the enterprise, to the ISP, but it's really an industry-wide problem that while we're not at the point of no return today, all the graphs are troubling. If any of them start to cross even just a little bit, we have a really, really serious industry-wide problem. With that, I'm done with the slide portion, and I've got plenty of time for questions, if there's any. I think please come up to a microphone. I'm sorry, they say you should go to a microphone. Go ahead.
Have there been any RCAs done on this? Like how do they get in? Is it you, PNP, advertising this DVR because it asked for it and the router allowed it? Or why is it on the internet?
It's a good question. I don't know. I would love to be able to call some of them up and have that conversation. My guess, and after, I've read a lot of the chat rooms, people, I think the best way to find out is if you just read some of the chats of people how to set this up. And it seems like all these enterprises love to port forward it through. So I think some of them are directly connected, but more likely, many enterprises get a single static IP, particularly some of the branch. So I expect it's mostly port forwarding so that they can access it externally. And that's what you'll see if you read any of the chats on setting it up.
I have one more question. Do they patch the vulnerabilities after themselves, or are they susceptible for future attacks and a large language model to go and compromise all of these and be under the control of one actor at some point? Yeah, it's a good question. The short answer is it's hard to know. We see things that are botnets that were actively support 6,000, right? They were, typical brand of DVR. And then they're no longer accessible, but they're still acting as bots. So did someone disable the external port? Did they patch the CVE? Did the service provider, someone filter it? We don't know. And, there's all sorts, the internet's an interesting place. There's all sorts of things. When we try to analyze Chinese devices, it's super hard because, there's this great firewall thing that makes so, there's multiple, the end-to-end model of the internet has gone away long ago, and it's hard to know when you've got different layers doing different filtering. But we absolutely see large number of devices that were once visible no longer are externally reachable, and we don't know why. Thank you.
Go ahead. I'll just alternate.
Yeah, so I kind of have maybe a two-part question. So one, have you observed in your studies any more targeted verticals and maybe even some seasonality to go with that? And then my other question would be, it looked like those were small spikes, so it looks like the trending duration might be different than maybe it used to be. A DDoS attack used to potentially go on for days, and now maybe it seems like it's more intense but shorter duration.
Yeah, so multiple questions. So, the data is really noisy, right? So there's like always gamers attacking gamers. So the reason by the way, you do DDoS, just to step back, you either do DDoS because, you're a government attacking other governments, you're doing ransom, attacking a bank, trying to do financial numbers, or you're a gambler, or you're a gamer who is losing and doesn't want that to go into your ranking. So you want to disrupt the session and reset it. So, the data is really noisy. There's all sorts of attacks that are kind of all over the map. It's a noisy data set, so it is hard to tease out specific. I will say traditionally Christmas is a lull. So you do see seasonality like that, and certainly you see geopolitical events like again whatever it was February, a big uptick. And that was the first part of your question. I've now totally forgot the second.
So the duration.
The duration, yeah. So it used to be DDoS went on for like hours. We now see things that are lasting minutes, and part of this. Or they're pulsing. And part of this is a lot of the current commercial product has some latency associated with it. So this is beyond the scope of this talk, but typically you've got to announce a BGP route, divert it, you have to do stuff. And by the time you're done, you're a couple minutes into it. So if you really want to cause someone pain, block them for 30 seconds, well before the traffic can be diverted to the scrubber, and then repeat that 10 minutes later. So we are seeing, I think it is a significant trend in much more intense, but shorter DDoS activity. We'll cut over to this side.
Hi, I'm just curious, it makes sense, your graphic about how the U.S. is now the #1 exporter of DDoS attacks. But do you have any data in your study that, the U.S. has a real strong penchant for, getting foreign products, into devices, right? Or for foreign, programmers or whatever. Do you have any data that supports where we're getting all that stuff? Because if a foreign country knows that the United States is a big or has wide open highways, as it were, for doing these things, then it makes sense that they would say, hey, let's just start putting them into our devices and sending them off to the U.S. So do you have any data on that? Or?
So again, to be clear, I'm not claiming any of these were intentionally
No,
compromised. Though again, they were blocking 1, 2, 3, 4, so they're clearly. I don't know. So it's hard to infer intent. What I can say is that the U.S. gets our stuff, and video cameras, the same place we get all the rest of our stuff. So it's cheap, Asian, typically manufacturing, and it's just price point. So I don't think the DVRs are any different from any other consumer or enterprise product.
Yeah, I don't think it's intent either. I just think it's it's driven by commerce, right? Like it's cheap and
they're really cheap cameras. Yeah.
So, okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said that the really interesting pivot that happened this year is the move from the consumer botnets into enterprise botnets, and it strikes me that there is actually a much easier way to remediate consumer botnets. And like most your customers are buying to protect the incoming traffic, right, for scrubbing centers. But what type of outbound control is there? Because if an enterprise, if ISP is going to block enterprise because he's sending botnet traffic, the enterprise will quickly go and block this device on his own firewall. And they're not doing today because they don't have a motivation, like you mentioned. And it's not about calling the customer because this is too long, but you just push the technical measure there. So are there really control point where you can try to implement that? Because I was surprised to hear about the outbound control. Usually I only am familiar with the inbound control.
So we sell technology and will happily sell technology to control either direction. I think the challenge here isn't always technical. The business problem and the social problem are always harder. Typically, no service provider ever wants to call a customer, whether they be enterprise or consumer, and tell them that they're compromised. What they will do in the RF world, in the mobile world, they'll disconnect you. So the RF world, they have policers and rate limiters and DPI. I mean, the mobile world has tons of stuff because RF has always been a very precious resource. You typically have had a cultural difference. It's been an anathema in the fixed line world. You know, I don't always understand the difference in the philosophies between fixed and mobile, or the cultural and social expectations. But there's service providers are really reluctant to put sort of different controls on fixed line traffic as opposed to mobile. But as I said, I don't think this is a technical problem as much as it's a business problem and I don't know, socioeconomic problem.
Seeing as how you say that enterprises are kind of the most prevalent, have you thought about using shame? Shame is usually a pretty good motivator, and like posting attribution. So there's, this business entity has 10,000 devices, this one, given your specific.
Nokia sells to enterprise. I don't think this would go over well with my peers.
But being a global problem, right? It might go beyond.
It's a tragedy of the commons. We would happily do this if Cisco did this, and Ericsson did this, and Huawei. Like, if we all decide at once, we're all going to do this. But it's very hard to be the first mover. The data is there, but as I said, technology is always sometimes the easier of the problems.
Thanks.
But I don't think we'll be shaming our customers anytime soon. But.
Yeah, so I try to understand the responsibility between ISP and service provider versus the end users, right? For example, enterprise does have IoT, which has been hacked and used as for DDoS attack. But I would say for that enterprise, it's in most cases they won't notice until someone tells them, right? Because they were initiating an attack, but for their firewall or whatever detection mechanism, they won't be able to figure that out efficiently. So is that fair to say that like ISP or service provider does have the advantage in their data point, right? Because they have all the data coming to their or passing through their devices. So do you think they bear a higher responsibility in handling such crisis?
I don't know if I don't know if I'm in a position to judge responsibility. I will say that typically service providers have security teams. They have a SOC. They've got people who do this and are, typically, a lot of this may be SMB, which just don't have that capability. They've got the IT guy who will claim he doesn't have DVR, whatever. So, I do think that, I am working, and I do believe that service providers have a very significant role to play in this. But as I said, it's as much a business challenge as technical.
Okay, thank you.
But as I said, it's also a matter of it's one of these things that has to get worse before it gets better. So I worked for a long time on IPv6. I spent like decades of my life on IPv6 and it was going nowhere. No one cared. I mean, nothing. I even wrote a blog that got picked up about why IPv6 failed. It took one thing to make IPv6 actually real. And we could see it coming. We had to exhaust IPv4. And it was only once Google and Azure, and now everyone's charging me whatever is $2 for. I mean, I now know the little cost of IPs every time I turn up a cloud instance. So, that's one example where things had to get worse before they got better, and we actually needed a business model where the industry valued IPv6 versus IPv4 because, well, IPv4 had a price. So, what worries me is that we need to, do we need to get to the point where we've got global internet outages because state actors have 100,000 gigabit connected bots before, as an industry, we take this, recognize it's a problem. I try to be optimistic, but I think, last several hundred years of sort of human experience suggests that we need to wait until this becomes a problem. Last question, I think.
Yeah, as someone who used to do IoT, I feel like a horrible person now, but so when I used to do this type of work, though, a big issue was businesses, they just cannot pay for good software, right? A lot of places for HVAC, they completely underfund them, and as a result, they have 15, 20-year-old controllers doing the work for them. I was wondering should this effort be more grassroots at the business level, because a lot of people, they don't buy up-to-date software, they don't update it, or they are doing horrible things like running IoT traffic on public Wi-Fi lobbies and other atrocities that I've seen. But yeah, it really seems to me like you have to make an effort to reach out to smaller businesses, because they're the ones that I assume that are buying this. They don't care. They buy the cheap product, they set it up, they leave it alone, and they leave it alone for at least 10 years.
Again, I just don't know. So I think this is as much a business problem as it is technical. I'm pretty sure I know how to solve the technical problem. I don't know how to deal with the SMB or the larger enterprise problem. And the problem is the stuff that goes in the network is there forever. By the way, trivia, does anyone know what the most common DNS request on the internet was until just a few years ago? Good guess, but no. Anyone else know? It was close to that. It was ntp.netgear.com, because they had hard-coded into entire generations default. And it would just do that. It had a bug where it was just requesting that again and again. So in some places, most DNS queries on the internet were nothing but ntp.netgear.com for many years. And it took a decade for that to kind of phase out. But once that stuff's in the network, it's never getting patched and never updated, particularly on the low end. Well, you've been a great audience, so thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.